Welcome to Recovering Evangelicals, a podcast for people who were once very comfortable in the Christian faith until the 21st century intruded and made it very hard to keep on believing. I'm your host, Luke Jansen.
And I'm Scott Dyer.
In calling ourselves Recovering Evangelicals, one of the things I'm recovering from is creationism. I grew up under a Young Earth Creationist umbrella, the worldview that shortens Earth history into just a few thousand years and insists that God carefully made all life. The first 2 decades of my life were shaped by that worldview. During the third and fourth decades of my life, though, I was increasingly finding reasons to reject that worldview and replacing that with a worldview that was still thoroughly creationist, but which stretched the timeline out into 50,000 or 100,000 years ago, which was radical for me at that time, and then gradually adding more and more zeros to those numbers. Scott, you grew up under both the Young Earth and the Old Earth Creationist umbrellas, but in the reverse order, I seem to remember.
Yeah, that's right. I grew up very much in, the old, I guess you could say old Earth with kind of an evolutionary viewpoint and so on. And then after I converted in my teens, then I kind of adopted the Young Earth view, or it was kind of thrust upon me. And I then, I think like a lot of people maybe in that position, I spent a lot of time on apologetic kind of stuff, defending it.
You fell into a pretty rowdy fundamentalist group, I seem to remember.
Yeah, I guess fairly. Yeah. But yeah, that was the expectation. And that was one of the questions I remember having for the person who was explaining the evangelical view to me and so on. I had a lot of questions around, well, what about evolution? What about this? And they pointed me towards the classic kind of stuff of the time, the Henry Morris books and things like that. And I guess I found them convincing enough, but I always had some level of skepticism. And then later on, when I went to seminary and began to dive a little deeper, I started to move away from it.
It's funny how that version of Christianity always seems to wilt once you start getting some learning into
you. That's very true. It's very,
Okay. Well, so for me then, when I was going through that period and I was just gradually extending the timeline, I realized there needed to be some more changes. And so I replaced the creation story described in the first 3 chapters of Genesis, that 6 days, each 24 hours long, and each one describing distinct acts of divine creation, basically a Christian version of Stephen Jay Gould's punctuated equilibrium. I replaced that Young Earth Creationist model with a model that didn't just have longer periods of time, but also included a lot of the secular science that I was learning. Big Bang cosmology, Darwinism, the modern synthesis, and others. But here's the thing. We meant evolution in a different way than the secular scientists meant it. For me, and enlightened Christians like me, God, or at least my evangelical Christian understanding of God, was orchestrating it all. In other words, that evolution is not random, but sometimes guided, redirected, and designed. And for a while, even up to a few years ago, still within the lifetime of this podcast, I was one of those, talking about how God used these naturalistic processes, including evolution, to achieve his creative goals. This is the world of intelligent design, and in that sense, I was still thoroughly a creationist.
Yeah, that kind of mirrors myself as well, I think, in a lot of ways. I found in the intelligent design idea, I guess, a way of reconciliation, I guess, or I felt at least that it maybe could reconcile. You didn't have to deny all science flat out, but you could believe that, okay, that's the process, but somehow God's in the design of that.
Right.
Yeah.
But in the back of my head, at least, there was a problem. There was a pushback, a counterargument that I quietly suppressed for a long term. This was an inconsistency. I noticed how ID proponents will talk only about biological phenomena that are profound and elegant and sophisticated and sometimes even beautiful. And one could even say that they're inherently good. So I'm referring to things like the origin of life or the genetic codes, the bacterial flagellum and hemoglobin, the clotting cascade, or complex symbiotic relationships between 2 different species. These are all profoundly beautiful and complex things. But the ID crowd never talked about other biological phenomena which are, again, profound and elegant and sophisticated, and seemingly quite difficult to explain using naturalistic science. But these phenomena are also exceptionally difficult to attribute to a benevolent designer. These phenomena don't look like they're good in any way. They look evil or malicious, cruel and sadistic jokes on the poor biological players involved. We've talked many times before about people choking on steak or getting chronic and lethal lung diseases when stomach acids end up in their delicate lungs simply because we use the same tube for eating, drinking, and breathing. And we've talked about so many women and babies dying horribly in childbirth simply because the baby's head is too big to squeeze through the pelvis. For me, those are fundamentally bad designs that didn't have to be like that. And the only defense I've ever heard from ID proponents is that we don't know the limitations that the designer was up against. So-called design constraints. I mean, even God can't make a square circle, right?
Yeah.
Even God can't create a rock so big that even he can't lift it. And so these designs for childbirth and for using the same plumbing for eating and breathing, these were the best compromises for physiological problems with incompatible design constraints. And I just don't buy that anymore. But the problem is, so many other people in the idea world are still quite satisfied with that explanation. And while I was mulling these ideas over, even a month ago, trying to figure out how to shape a follow-up episode to deal with this, I came across an article in my social media feed from Dr. Joel Duff, whose blog posts and YouTube channel I highly recommend. He was highlighting yet another Young Earth Creationist article that focused on defense and attack structures. This Young Earth Creationist article insisted that all animals were originally created to be vegetarian, a few thousand years ago, of course, but because of human sin, the animals became carnivorous, developed fangs and venoms, predation strategies, and camouflage in response to escape predation. All these malicious and cruel designs were in fact the fault of humans, not God, according to this article. And they used some really flimsy argumentation to push the idea. And I thought, okay, this is it. I want to do this article, this topic, attack and defense structures, because it addresses concerns for Young Earth Creationists and for the ID crowd. These are examples of designs which do already work well, and they have worked well for thousands or millions of species of life and for millions or billions of years. In other words, there were no design constraints, no need for compromises, and yet in some other species, those perfectly functional designs were changed in incredibly sophisticated ways, which calls into question design. They were changed into something that looks cruel, malicious, or again, we could even use the word evil. And these sophisticated designs are so intricate, so highly tuned, so difficult to explain scientifically if one dogmatically excludes undirected evolution, while dogmatically insisting upon intentional creationism, intelligent design. Well, then now these altered, repurposed, and cruel designs, they really force one to adjust one's view on the designer himself.
Yeah, you could easily think what kind of a malicious being would bring about some of these things that we've been looking at recently, in the podcast, the jewel wasp and the whole issue of venom and things of that nature. Of course, the kind of catch-all response to that problem is the quote fall. The fact that once they indulged in disobedience in the garden, somehow all creation was magically changed into this, what we see now, which is really on many levels a very hellish existence.
Yeah. So we wanted to compare notes with Joel Duff because he's the one who brought this to my attention. He wrote that article in response to the Answers in Genesis article, and he's going to tell us about that. So we reached out to him again, and here he is. Joel, Dr. Duff, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me back.
Joel's already been on the podcast 3 times before. We've fully unpacked his backstory there, so we won't do that again. Listeners can go back to episodes number 26 and 68 for that. But we will say that, Joel, you're a fully credentialed evolutionary biologist working at a state university, the University of Akron, doing hands-on genetic and biological research for almost 3 decades, and you host a vigorous blog and YouTube channel exploring the interplay between faith and science, with a particular emphasis on Young Earth Creationism, and often focused on Answers in Genesis and Ken Ham for over a decade. So we really appreciate the feedback that you're going to give us on this question. Now, again, you've been focusing your attention on Young Earth Creationism, and we've been focusing ours on intelligent design. Young Earth Creationists tend to be anti-science or compensate by radically distorting science. while ID proponents pride themselves in embracing science and doing their best to incorporate generally accepted science into their arguments. But I think Scott does, and I think you do too as well, Joel, we think that this topic of defense and attack structures trips them both up. So let's start a discussion there. Did you get any response, Joel, from Young Earth Creationists on your article? Did they respond to you?
Not formally, not in the sense of like the organizations that put out this material. Really rarely do they respond like in a public way to these things. So the responses I get are most social media post responses, comments by vigorous defenders of young earth creationism on the internet, but they're not necessarily, as you know, necessarily the most enlightened version of young earth creationism. But generally, the response is just they attack the person and not really the actual argument. And so I can safely say I really haven't gotten a response that made me think, oh, I need to go back and rethink that, or how might I better respond to this, or maybe that was an effective argument. I haven't really heard any direct defenses, for the young earth creationist movement. But again, that doesn't mean those don't exist. But currently, the young earth creationist organizations are very good at sort of pumping out material, but not actually doing much follow-up in their literature.
And not engaging with the broader scientific community. I know that's a frustration of mine.
It's a very insular thing. And so they do not have like regular communication with me. I mean, they don't have discussions with those that disagree. It's more of a, here's our formal response, but without an interaction back and forth. And if they do respond to the actual argument, it's just a cherry-picked line or two in which they sort of pick out one thing and then take it off on a new angle rather than sort of addressing the whole issue.
Right.
I'm curious, Luke, you've already mentioned that we're coming a little more from dealing with the design people as opposed to the young earth creationists. But I'm curious, Joel, do you come up against the design movement as well? Or in the real world of dealing with students and just in general, is young earth creationism still kind of the dominant trend?
Well, that's a really intriguing question because it's very much where I am and what audience I'm in that I might frame my response differently. So I stand in front of a classroom, in a secular classroom, and I'm teaching, say, evolutionary biology right now. And I have a lot of discussions about, we talk about William Paley, in my intro, sort of the history of philosophy, of thought, and so forth. I spent a lot of time just sort of building up, like, why do we even have these thoughts today? Okay. And we talk about, the watchmaker, the watch and design. And you can see that students are very, I even frame it as like, this is something that it sounds very intuitive in terms of a design argument. And we're going to have to address that in terms of like, how might you explain things that we look at in the world, especially in the biological world, and see incredible design. I mean, there's not really another better word for it, right?
Yeah.
It is an amazing design of different complex features. And so we kind of cycle back around to that. I have these Q&A sessions that are anonymous, and I often get many questions. And they're not so much about young earth creationism, even though I might sort of mention that once in a while. And I know I have creationists in the audience. They really do sort of settle on that sort of design thing because it is the most intuitive argument sort of against maybe evolution as the perception that it's just chance and randomness.
Right.
And so that dialogue between this is just chance and this is all design is something that I think every person gravitates to when they start going down this path. However, I also am in a lot of other areas where young earth creationism would be the dominant sort of area of discussion. But, they grab onto that design argument and use it. But I'm sure both of you are aware that intelligent design has got a lot of different nuances. It's a very different beast than young earth creationism is.
It is. Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure. It's interesting, too. We've talked about on this program. In fact, we had a whole program on it about the fact that even evolutionists themselves have a hard time avoiding design language. Even in our discussions on venoms recently, it's just very hard to avoid because in our human understanding of things, we see design everywhere, right?
Sure, we have to weigh. Yeah, we have to have ways of describing the world around us, and we talk about things in phenomenal language all the time.
Right.
And I use the word design in my class quite frequently, and I even find myself saying the word and then almost pausing, like, okay, now design in a particular sense. So we'll talk about what that is later. Right. In fact, I almost always highlight when I say it by accident, almost as a way of saying, you need to think about what this word means.
Right.
This is a really important word that has a lot of different meanings to a lot of different people. And so I know I'm using that word, but understand that it can have many different meanings. The wording here actually probably illustrates how difficult it is to talk about this topic.
Yeah.
We did a whole episode on that.
Right.
Episode number 141.
Because every word you want to say, you realize has like 3 other senses to it, and you want to define every term. And so it becomes very difficult to talk about. But in class, we would talk about the fact that because of the environment is going to choose certain combinations of things that work for that particular environment. So if you look at convergent evolution, we just talked about Australia and placental animals and how there's like all these features of different placentals that sort of match the characteristics of the Tasmanian wolf is kind of like a carnivore in North America. And that environment has sculpted and gradually made an animal that fits that environment really well and happens to converge on the similar traits. But the underlying genes and the underlying alleles and genetics of them are very, very different. But we'd still say that looks like a great design for that environment. Well, that design has been crafted multiple times in multiple different similar environments.
Right.
So natural selection, genetic drift, mutations, all these different things that are just happening also are sculpting, are being guided. See, I just used the word guided, right?
Yeah.
The word guide, you have to talk about what does guide mean, and who is the guider. And, it's like, but...
Yep, I hear you. Now, you were describing what you do in the classroom a few moments ago, but you do the same thing on your blog. You have a blog post, and one of the things you're doing in your blog is responding to articles that Young Earth Creationist organizations are putting out about a particular animal, a particular, unique feature of these animals or an event in history. And so you're doing a lot of writing on this, that, and the other thing all over the place because you're responding to them. So here's my question. Do you ever feel like you're playing whack-a-mole?
Yes, there are times where you ask yourself, I'm going to say the same thing again. How many more times am I going to have to say that? But there's a function and a purpose to all this. It's very, I think about a strat. It is strategic. Saying the same thing over again, it might sound like I take the next article, it's a different organism, but essentially it's the same story. It's the same misconceptions that are underlying those things. So it's actually fairly easy to write because it's like, I've already written this post again. I'm going to write a different way about a different thing. But the most important thing is we live in a society where it's the new thing that's written. It's the new article. It's the new podcast. That's the thing that's heard. That's the thing that's shared. So even though you could say like, well, I've already written this 25 times, somebody wants to search for it, they can find my thoughts on that. You kind of have to just keep putting out the same thing again. And sure, lots of people have already seen it, but I just received an email 2 days ago from a person sitting in a classroom at a Christian college. He was listening to the professor and they were having some doubts about what they were saying. It was Young Earth Creationist lecture, essentially. And they had found my blog through searching and they had started reading things and were exact things that professor was talking about. And I was saying something in response to that same topic. And so they had a lot of questions for me. And we got into a little bit of dialogue about that. And if I hadn't been putting out something very fresh, because I had just written about something that they had just said, that might not have been triggered. And so you just don't know who that next person is out there that's looking or seeking or asking questions. So the whack-a-mole thing is like, yeah, it's like, it's always going to exist. They're going to say the same things over again. You kind of have to say the same thing back because if you don't, if nobody says anything, then that just becomes the truth. If we live in a society where if somebody just says the same thing 500 times, pretty soon enough people will believe what is said if no one questions it.
Yeah.
Right. So we're going to come back to this whole idea of these arguments that keep coming back, but I want to set the stage first. One of the articles that they wrote was this one that you addressed, the defense and attack structures. One central theme in the Young Earth Creationist worldview is that all animals were originally vegetarian, but became carnivorous after the fall. And I feel this is a naive idea for so many reasons, but it may make sense to non-experts, that idea, because they haven't thought out the implications. Herbivores, for example, have molars for crushing, but not incisors for tearing and shredding. So how are the first carnivores going to eat unless they magically get a brand new set of teeth? But most importantly, the carnivores just don't have the kind of intestinal system that you need to digest plant fibers. And so, if you look around at all the herbivores, just picture a cow, a horse, a hippopotamus, or an elephant. They've all got these big, gigantic, round bellies compared to carnivores. And that's because they need 10 times as much intestine to digest the plant fibers. So, I mean, can you imagine a lion or a tiger trying to chase down a gazelle when they've got a stomach like a cow? Right?
Yeah. You talk about indigestion.
Yeah. It really is kind of a magical view, isn't it? Like I know for myself, when in my kind of YEC days, I guess, which were kind of short-lived, but anyway, the sense was that, once they bit into that fruit, this kind of magical thing happened. The world just transformed all of a sudden all around them. It's not at all scientific. There's no thought given to what you're talking about, all the actual details. And that's okay if you want to believe in magic, but you can certainly understand why the scientific community would reject that.
Yeah, you could say that much of their audience is naive, like most of the American public, of like the details of biology. Like you just talk about the intestines. I think most people wouldn't know that a carnivore has a very short intestinal tract, right? They don't have a 4-chambered stomach and they're not regurgitating their food, all that stuff. So, but you've got people who work for Young Earth Creationist organizations who are intelligent and have actually studied and know these things. And so that it becomes the interesting question there is like, how do they parse that knowledge, that information, there's what they know about science with, okay, now I got to come up with an explanation for this. And unfortunately, there's a big disconnect between the literature of Young Earth Creationism in terms of dealing with those specific like details, right? Look, like you just gave, you would find, if you go out in the Young Earth Creationist literature, are you going to find a detailed explanation or a hypothesis even for that, other than the hand wavy thing, which is in the article we're discussing here right now, which are general design principles, just like sort of like large hypotheses of just like this could have happened, ad hoc ideas.
Okay. So this has come up a second time, so maybe I should deal with this now. I said a few moments ago we were going to talk about these arguments that keep coming back, and now you've just made a reference.
Yeah, let's do it.
These leaders rehashing the same arguments over and over. Let's talk about the leaders in these movements, the Young Earth Creationists and the ID world, who are pushing these arguments that just keep coming back up. Scott and I talked directly to a couple leaders in the ID field. We talked to Michael Behe and Jonathan McClatchy. That was 3 or 4 years ago in episodes number 132 and 136. And I asked why they keep pushing the same ideas that have been shot down time and time again by experts in the respective fields. And I wondered out loud in a subsequent episode, I wondered if they're just being willfully ignorant, they know better, but they keep pushing a dead idea on a gullible audience. And then, Joel, I saw in your articles, you were saying something similar about Young Earth Creationist articles. I'm not going to mention the names, but I read one article you were talking about one particular guy, and you said, here I'm quoting you, you said, this guy is someone who has studied this history in detail and knows better than what he tells his audiences. And then another person, again, I'm not going to mention the name, but you said, quote, this guy's approach reveals not just a misunderstanding of how science works, but a troubling disregard for the intelligence of his own audience. And so, Joel, I got to ask, are we, you and I and Scott, saying that these are con artists?
Ooh, yeah, I know. I remember that quote of myself and who I was talking about. And I'm particularly frustrated by that particular individual and a few other individuals within Young Earth Creationism for blatant, willful ignorance, I'll say. And I think that they know it. But I'm going to say that I don't think that is the majority view in Young Earth Creationism. And I'm going to say that because we do have some insiders in like Answers in Genesis and others that they truly believe they're doing God's work. I mean, they're not there to make money. They're not there to rip off people consciously. They are, they're doing all they can to raise funds and convince people to give them money. And they're going to say whatever they need to say in order to get that money. And part of that is a the same way the political system works is you need to hype up your product, and you need to hype up the dangers that you're fighting and all those types of things in order to whip up the support. And that's just like this constant process of trying to get that funding coming in. And that might require stretching the truth a little bit and making something seem more important than it really is. But at the end of the day, they're true believers. They really believe that they're doing God's work here. They're defending the word. And cognitively, I'm sure they realize that these are hard questions. I don't really have all the answers, but the answer must exist. I know the ultimate truth. Ultimately, I'm right. See, that's what it ultimately comes down to. I'm right because the Bible says this, and there is no other interpretation, and the Bible is the truth. I have to stand upon that. It's the authority. And therefore, the world is young. The world did start with no death before the fall. Adam's sin caused that death and changed the world. And therefore, I don't know how that works, but it has to work. And so even if I just throw out hypotheses and ideas and possibilities, and I just hope in the future that we'll explore those more and we'll find out more. And then you create a boogeyman of secular culture fighting against them and creating, being in warfare with them. And whatever it takes in warfare to win is what you need to do. And if right now it means sort of lying to your audience in order to keep them on board because eventually you're going to find the answers, then you just keep doing that. But you have faith that in the future it's all going to work out. We'll have the solutions. We'll know. We won't maybe never know why defense structures, how they came to be, but we know that they must have come to be after the fall. And you're just so confident in that you are being honest when you say like evolutionary biology is wrong. You just don't have confident, convincing, answers to the contrary.
But the problem is that their people are just not specific experts in the field. They're very general. Some of them, as I understand it, and I'll ask you in a minute to address this, but some of them don't even seem to be scientists. They're just very generalist, well-read people, and they're making these arguments. And yet, contra to them, opposite them, you have experts in the fields who know what they're talking about. They've studied it for decades. Now, for example, the bacterial flagellum. How many times haven't we heard talk about the bacterial flagellum? We talked to Michael Behe, and again, it came up, same thing with Jonathan McClatchy. But we followed that up with a conversation with 3 world experts, people who actually study the bacterial flagellum. One was Australia, one was Britain, and one was in the States, and they've been doing this for decades. And we got a completely different story, and yet next week there's another article from a Young Earth Creationist talking about the bacterial flagellum. And then there's the article that you responded to, Joel, talking about these defense and attack structures, the snake venoms. We talked to an expert who's been studying snakes for 30 years. We talked to another expert who's been studying the jewel wasp for a couple decades. They know what they're talking about, and we get a completely different story from them than we do from these Young Earth Creationist writers of these articles. So again, how can we be so generous then to their motives if they keep on resurrecting arguments that have been soundly refuted by experts in the fields, and they just keep bringing them back again?
Well, yeah. Like, there's no easy answer to that question. Because it's rooted in, and I think about this all the time because I experience this on things like I go on to some particular YouTube channels where, being an expert is tantamount to like you're the least faithful person that you can be heard, because there's an enormous amount of effort put into by Young Earth Creationists into dismissing expertise. Because where does expertise come from in their mind? It comes from you were trained in a secular institution, you have all this, and the more training you have, the more you become part of the system, right? You're becoming part of the mainstream, which has just sculpted your mind to the point where you're unable to think outside the box, where you're unable to like be creative and actually see the real truth. And so then you're set up for, like, once you become an expert, now you almost can't, you're almost not allowed to have an opinion about these other things because you can't be trusted because of how you've come to gain that expertise.
Right.
And this is where the whole conspiracy theory stuff comes in. People are attracted to conspiracies because it feels like I have special knowledge. Like, here's all these experts out here. I have this other data, this other information. that they're not even willing to consider because they've been so focused and so trained into the modern paradigm that they can't get their head out of it, and yet I can.
Right.
And it sets themselves up as being higher and better than an expert. But, would you, I mean, there's so many other fields where, like, I had surgery recently, right? I'm not going to go to, I wanted somebody who was an expert,
Right.
somebody who had a lot of experience, somebody who had done the same surgery many, many, many times. And I'm not going to find somebody else who has an alternative idea for how to treat this particular problem that I had and try out their thing because they have a blog site.
Right.
By the way, I have been told on Facebook about many alternative treatments that I should be using instead of the treatments that I got.
Yeah.
It's our human nature to want to feel like we're special and we know something that others don't. And then I have something to communicate and help others with, right? I have something to share. I have something I can promote. Sorry, I'm getting far stream of the Young Earth Creationism thing, but it is a conundrum, right? It's and Luke, as you said, many Young Earth Creationists don't have expertise in the area that they're talking about. They're conscripted into it. Like often they're brought in, they're engineers or they're medical. They've gone to medical school. There's a lot of people that are biologists, and they'll even call themselves an evolutionist. And usually what that means is I went to school and one time I had an evolutionary biology class, and at the time I thought it sounded kind of convincing, so therefore I'm an evolutionist. It doesn't mean they studied evolution and actually participated in research and thought through those processes. And so many Young Earth creationists are coming from, I did this, so it gives me cred as a scientist. And now I am now talking as like I'm an expert in all these different disciplines. And I do this all the time. I'm talking about geology. I'm talking about lots of different things. I love it because I get to learn lots of things, but I'm not claiming I'm an expert in these areas. I'm just claiming I'm able to read. I'm able to use my general knowledge of how science functions and be able to assess literature and assess whether something is a good hypothesis or not. And that's what Young Earth creationists should be able to do if they have real training. But many of them come from areas that are sort of tangential to real like research science. Like if you've been trained as a doctor, you really haven't had a lot of training in actual medical research unless you specifically went into medical research. But people hear doctor and they think, oh, well, they must be really, really smart, and therefore I can trust them when they talk about plant defensive structures.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned engineers, and it's true that a lot of the YEC people, it's including the founders, I believe that Gish and Morris were both engineers. And that kind of makes sense to me in a way, because what do engineers do? They design, right? I mean, they're designers. And to me, it's not a stretch to think that they take that engineering mindset and they look at nature and they say, look, it's so engineered, but without going below the surface a little bit to think about how that comes about.
Yeah, I'm the current president of Institute for Creation Research, Randy Gugliuzza. He has an engineering background and a medical degree.
Okay.
And he is promoting this whole theory of biological design as like a replacement for modern, basically biological theory. And his idea is that, yes, organisms are all engineered and they're responding to the environment, and they have built-in responses, essentially like pre-programmed responses that God has put into them. So God has design them in such a way that they're pre-prepared for every possible future outcome. And they simply are tripping switches essentially over time to adapt to their new environments. He's very much opposed to natural selection as being a real phenomena, that there is the environment is the chooser, because going back to something we talked about earlier, difficulty in using terms. Like we talk about design, we talk about natural selection, choosing, right? That sounds like it's a force, right? Sounds like it's like a thing. Like natural selection is a god, right? And it's choosing. We just naturally use that language, but we don't mean that the environment is an entity that is choosing certain individuals for survival and reproduction.
Right.
But he sees it that way, right? He sees it as, that's what he thinks that evolutionists are doing, is they're not anthropomorphizing, they're actually making it into a god.
Right.
And so he's explicitly trying to reject that. and say that no, the creature's already has built into it everything it needs, and it is the one choosing how it's going to change to the environment, rather than the environment choosing it.
Right.
So this, I understand, is another one of the new ideas that are coming out in the Young Earth Creationists and the intelligent design community. I mean, the old ideas that kept coming up, and I think they still do, irreducible complexity is one.
Yeah.
The proto-animals, that the Ark had all these proto-animals. That's an argument that they've come up with, and it's been refuted, it's been shot down, but they keep bringing it up. Now there's this new idea that, I'll just use the word pre-programming. God pre-programmed all these sets of genes in the animals, and some were supposed to stay turned off until the flood happened, and then they get turned on, and vice versa. Maybe you want to say a few things about this whole pre-programming idea that's coming out.
Yeah, it's the idea that, if the original world, the perfect creation, was a globe, not just the Garden of Eden, but everything around the world was a sort of pleasant environment, right? It would have been hostile. It wouldn't have had hurricanes or landslides killing animals, since no animals would die. And it wouldn't have had necessarily like deserts or icy worlds. And then you look at the world today and you're like, all these organisms are adapted to very highly varied environments and very dangerous environments. The Young Earth Creationist is faced with the question of like, how did they transition from life in a pleasant garden where there was no danger to I'm living in a world where there's chaos and anything could happen to me at any moment. I have to defend myself. And so one of the ideas, like you just said, was that maybe God, knowing ahead of time that after the flood, there was going to be a radically different environment that had never been experienced by the organisms that were part of the original creation. Looking ahead and knowing that, or having foreknowledge of that future environment, endowed in the original created organisms genetic codes. It's got to be genetic of some sort. There's got to be some information, some kind of like information that allows an organism to know how to respond to the environment into the original organisms, but that they didn't use those things. Like I didn't need sharp teeth and I didn't need venom and I didn't need, give it all these different characteristics until some later date. So the organisms had to divide, right, and reproduce over and over and over, which means they had to take their genome, which had that information stored in it somewhere, and then pass it to the next generation over and over again. It had to go through that bottleneck on Noah's Ark, where most organisms died. So whatever programs were there had to have made it through that animal. And then somehow some lever was pulled by the future environment. Like it's also, wow, this is a desert and I don't have any water and I need to conserve water. So I need to change the length of my nephron so I can conserve water and I'm not urinating as much. There was already a genetic switch, a regulatory pathway that was turned on or off that then changed that development such that you change the characteristic of that kidney for that new environment. And so what's really intriguing about this is that, for one thing, it suggests that there are many programs that are in organisms, like if you sequence a genome, that maybe an organism isn't using, and they're still waiting for a future day in which maybe 1,000 years from now, maybe because of climate change, organisms, God already knows about that and has already programmed creatures that are alive today to be able to adapt to that future time, and the programs are there. Well, there's a testable prediction from that, right? I should be able to sequence the genome and see that there are stretches of portions of genome where there are genes and obvious regulatory sequences for which we find no function now that are sitting around waiting for their future opportunity to be used. But one big problem with this is their own theory of genetic entropy and mutations and decay, and the world is running down, right? So what happened after creation when organisms, we know that anytime a genome copies itself, it makes mistakes. There's been no genome ever studied that has ever managed to copy itself multiple generations without making a mistake. What prevents those mistakes from happening in those codes that have been set aside for the future use? Because we know that natural selection is a process that preserves sequences that are useful to organisms by weeding out those mutations. But if you've had to go through 100 generations or 1,000 generations into the future before you're going to use something, what's the mechanism? These are the types of questions I would ask a young Earth creation. What is your mechanism for preserving those God-made portions of code that you're not using now and you're going to use in the future. Because to me, they're going to break before they ever get a chance to be used.
Right.
And so there's an inconsistency in young Earth creationism where they have this one theory of genetic entropy, which is suggesting that all organisms are basically they don't have a future. Like the world doesn't have a long-term future because genetic decay should be building up. Natural selection can't get rid of all the negative mutations, and therefore we're all doomed to extinction. But this idea of pre-programming doesn't jive with that idea of young Earth creationism. And this is where I go back to like one theory causes a problem with other own theories.
Yeah.
Because it's not a cohesive whole theory that explains multiple different pieces of evidence.
Right.
So you've described this pre-programming. They would suggest that there's pre-programming to respond to a future scenario that's not present right now. But some of that pre-programming, so for example, we learned about all the changes that have to happen to turn a four-legged reptile into a venomous snake. There's a lot of genetic changes and biochemical changes that have to go into that. So is God the one who put in all that pre-programming to turn these lizards into snakes who are now dealing with a whole new kind of environment, a whole new resource that they're trying to exploit? It's God putting the knives and the guns in the hands of the animals. It doesn't reflect well on God.
Yeah, it does raise some theological conundrums, right?
Right.
Of course, that's an age-old question about the author of evil and you know, going back to the very beginning.
Right.
Much ink has been spilt over that.
Yeah.
I don't think we're going to solve that question. But from going back all the way to your original point about if you have an original creation where there's no death, so there's no function for many different characteristics. You know, when we look at organisms today, we would say like in totality, we can look at all their features and say like they serve a function, right? We don't have odd features for which we can find no function whatsoever. They have no useful value. They work somehow in the environment to allow us to survive, whatever organism you're talking about. In that original creation, there's no death, which means that you don't need to be perfectly sculpted to live in that world if you can't die. And so that does raise kind of the question, like where do these features come from? I think that may be why young Earth creationists, some will say the other idea about where defense attack structures come from is they already existed because like, yeah, you could have long teeth, you could look like a carnivore, but you didn't have to eat meat because you were going to live anyway. You were going to survive.
But you can't
however,
you can't eat sugar cane with those fangs.
Well, you could eat watermelons though, right? The T-Rex, you know, is eating a watermelon, which I find ironic too, because the original watermelon, I just looked this up today because I was thinking about it. The original watermelon in terms of natively, before we made it huge, through artificial selection ourselves, was, you know, maybe like 4 or 5 inches in size. So even the young Earth creationist picture of a T-Rex like eating this giant watermelon in the original garden is not a reflection of the actual natural history of watermelons themselves.
Right. Well, the other thing too is that the time problem, like young Earth creationists, emphasis on young Earth, you know, believe that the world's been around for 8,000 or so years. So these genetic changes that were pre-programmed in happened instantly. Like there wasn't time for thousands of generations of change that these genes would express. After the flood, they suddenly had, you know, whatever, you know, they needed to, you know, and that doesn't comport at all with what we know about genetic change.
Yeah, absolutely, Scott. And Luke, I think you had mentioned earlier about, or we had been talking earlier, maybe before we started recording, about the complexity of venoms, all this concoction, and then how they're excreted and how the organs that produce them and how they have to protect themselves with their own proteins or things that are breaking them down. I mean, there's just, it's a very complex system. And yet young Earth creationists kind of treat that as, well, you could have had a gene duplication, or you had like a developmental switch, and then you made venom. Yeah. I'm like, well, it's not just making venom. It's actually packaging it, delivering it at the right time, and different snakes have different venoms for different kinds of prey that they've been around in different environments. So it's not just a generalistic thing. You're saying it's very complex. It's not one allele. It's not one change. It's this change, this change, this change, this change, this change, this change. And to go to the design aspect, Others would be right to say, like, you can't get those kind of combinations of alleles because we're going to say they're mutations potentially. Like I had a mutation here, a mutation here, a mutation here. You'd have to have an accumulation of a lot of mutations, changing a lot of developmental switches over a short period of time.
Yeah.
There's not nearly enough time to have that many mutations produced in order for natural selection to select all the combinations that could work to make a functioning venomous system.
Right.
And so that just excludes young Earth creationism from being able to evolve a venom system,
Right.
which many young Earth creationists try to say that basically that's an evolved system after the flood or after creation.
Yeah.
And the designist will say, like, it's so complicated, it couldn't happen by chance and natural selection because it is such a complicated system. And then the question is, can natural selection do that over long, long periods of time? At least there's a chance of that happening. I'll admit, you can't make a venomous system in 4,000 years.
Right.
Through any known natural mechanism.
Right.
And I wanted to jump on that. That was one of the points I did want to come to, and here we are. We're at this point. Just this idea that these examples that we talked about, that Scott and I talked about in the past couple of weeks, the snake and the jewel wasp, they're both highly evolved animals. It's not just one, and you just said this a second ago, it's not just one, a couple changes. It's very designed, and if you're going to be a creationist, you have to somehow deal with the idea that these snakes were designed, this jewel wasp was designed. They love to pounce on the examples of design that don't have these moral implications. They'll talk about the bacterial flagellum or the blood clotting cascade, but if they now have to talk about the venomous snakes and the emerald jewel wasp being how they came about to be, you can't avoid attributing design to those without acknowledging the cruelty and malice and the lack of design constraints. Here we have this designer, code speak for God, designing these monster machines that kill in a very cruel way.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, Young Earth Creationists is going to, the simple way to deal with that is just simply toss it back on Adam's back, right?
Right.
If Adam hadn't sinned, those animals could have continued to exist in a pleasant, wonderful world and not have died, and they wouldn't have needed to attack other organisms. But somehow our sin and our malice and our greed and our so forth has been cast upon the entire world such that they all do that. And then it's by God's grace that he has given organisms the ability to defend themselves. And but then when you say, but is it God's grace to give organisms the ability to attack another organism? That's where it gets a little harder, to follow that train of thought.
Yeah, and so I was going to mention that as well. So again, coming back to the idea of the pre-programming and God giving the snakes this pre-programming to work the way they do. But then, one of the things that we also learned from our expert is that some number of species of animals have developed resistance to snake bites. The honey badger, the mongoose, the hedgehog, the opossum, and certain ground squirrels all have resistance to snake bites. It's a series of intricate genetic changes that lead to this resistance. And so then the argument could be, well, God pre-programmed that. This was something he anticipated. These animals are going to have to deal with snakes, and so he pre-programmed them. But then here's my question. God equipped those animals, I mentioned 6 species, but specifically did not do that for a lot of other animals, including humans. And so that makes God very vindictive and capricious.
Well, obviously he liked honey badgers much more than he liked other organisms.
Right. All right, guys, we are going long, and there's so many things that I still want to ask Joel, but I know there's one particular one that you were mentioning earlier that you did want to address. So this has to do with the leaders and the writers in these Young Earth Creationist organizations, the fact that they're not really experts in their fields. We talked a bit about that, but maybe we can say more. But there was one in particular, Joel, one that wrote the article that you addressed, the defense and attack structures,
Yeah.
written by Harry F. Sanders III. I understand there's a bit of a story to tell about this guy. So, Joel, why don't you just mention a few things about these writers and these leaders and Harry F. Sanders?
Yeah, I'll begin by saying there's been some dramatic developments at Answers in Genesis in particular, which is where Harry F. Sanders is employed. But Answers in Genesis back in December laid off a large number of staff, writers, developers, people working in the background, and so forth. Actually, they released several of their PhD scientists as well, but it was a large slash to the budget. And so one thing they had done, and one thing this organization had done, is they had cultivated 4 or 5 PhDs that had science, maybe in quotes, in some cases, PhDs, but always spoke to all kinds of scientific things. They got rid of a couple of those and several other writers, and it is noticeable how fewer new articles there are, especially science-related articles. There's still lots of, like every day there's a new article on the Answers Genesis website. I go there every day and there's always something new, but it's all 90% of the time it's some kind of culture war, culture issue rather than a science issue. Also, Ken Ham has a daily blog thing now. So his face and his presence is very much felt today, which is interesting because 2 years ago, they hired Martin Iles from Australia to come to America to be his replacement. It was very clear. He was like the anointed future Ken Ham. He had the accent and everything. All right. I thought it was a miracle hire. I couldn't believe they found somebody who really seemed to fit the bill. Mm-hmm. And within a year, Martin Iles was gone. And he's off to start his own ministry doing something else. I don't want to go into any details. I have some insiders who've told me things about some things that have happened inside. There's been some scandals, which might have led to Martin Iles saying, maybe this isn't the place for me. But what's happened now is now we've had this budget cut. We have Ken Ham there. He's the face again of Answers in Genesis. And we have many fewer writers. And he doesn't have a replacement yet. And he's not getting younger. And there's a lot of questions about what will happen in the future there. So now, but specifically to the science writing, I'm watching very closely. They have a journal that Answers in Genesis called the Answers Research Journal, and that is their peer-reviewed journal that has an editor that had been Andrew Snelling, one of their PhD geologists who's now retired and is no longer doing that job. And they had published something like, I don't know, maybe 25 or 30 journal articles last year that are more than a blog post, right? It's actual references and like discussions and having supposedly some kind of reviewers. I would say some of them to me are interesting because they delve a little bit farther into maybe some things like we just talked about, not some high hypothesis with no evidence, but trying to delve into some issues. And I'm making a big deal about this because it's been since December 10th that they've published any article in that journal. And this is after many years of doing 30 to 40 articles a year. We're now into about 5 months with no new article. I don't know if that's because they don't even have an editor anymore. They do officially have an editor. But I've also noticed other journals in Young Earth Creationist world also have a reduced number of articles. And so this is an interesting decline in the, I'll say the more scholarly work of Young Earth Creationists. It is really turning into a influencer movement, right? To go back to what we said about why do people just keep repeating the same things over again? Because that's the way modern society works in a lot of ways now. It's influence. It's just repeating the same stuff over and over, getting your message out over and over and over again, and just repeating the previous materials and rehashing them. That's the easiest thing to do. It's the cheapest thing to do when you have fewer resources, although Answers in Genesis is not struggling. They have $173 million of free money, right, really. And so they're very wealthy.
I was going to ask you then, was this, the fact that they laid off all these scientific writers, was that a budgetary thing, which I kind of doubted, or is it that they recognize, yeah, we can't compete in the science world?
They seem to be ditching. Well, they've never been really that involved in the science world. I think it's always been appearances. We have some PhDs. We pretend like we do research, but they've left it to ICR and the Creation Research Society to do the more scholarly stuff. They've never been that committed to it. So it's almost like they have Nathaniel Jeanson and a few others there that have the Harvard PhD, and they're there just for appearances. They rarely use them. They don't really do a lot of talks. They make a few videos. They're kind of like side things that they do, but they can always say, oh, and our Harvard PhD says this. So that's not a commitment to science. And given their budget, they've never spent much money. They don't send their people out to scientific conferences. They don't interact with other scientists. There's not a commitment to doing science. But the other issue is that they've kind of explored most of the topics. I don't think there's a lot of novel things for them to do other than get into the details. And every time they try to get into the details, what does it do? It creates problems. Like if they start to get into the details, just like you and I have just barely touched, the complexity of defense and attack structures and the genetics of that, and they tried to actually explore their hypothesis and turn it into a working model of how to explain the genetics, every one of them that starts doing that will realize I can't do this and I can't publish it. I don't know what to say. they've kind of run the course in terms of like exploring all the different possible hypotheses and models that they just throw out for the flood or for this or for that. And so there isn't any room to grow anymore as a science, because there's no more. All that's left is the details, and the details don't work.
Hmm.
This is my feeling and my impression of sort of like the wane of scholarly activity in the creationist community. It's
Okay.
almost defeatism. It's almost like we're just going to turn the page and say, like, we've got broad answers and we believe they're right, and now we're on to just the culture wars, and let's just try to win that way.
Yeah.
And what about Harry F. Sanders? You seem there's a story about him.
Yeah, I did need another minute to think about what I was going to say about Harry F. Sanders. He and I have a long history going back to when he, just shortly after he graduated from a Christian college, and he was very young. And I followed his blog since like the very beginning of a very small blog, and I had interactions with him. Now, he wasn't called Harry F. Sanders III at the time. He has had a pseudonym for a long period of time. It took me a long time to make the connection between Harry F. Sanders III when Harry F. Sanders III started writing articles for AIG, and the person that I've known for a long time under a different name, who also had a YouTube channel, has had a blog, and has other social media separate from Answers in Genesis. And he and I have sparred a lot. And so he has been pretty outspoken about me at Answers in Genesis, more so than most. I found it very surprising that he survived the cut when Answers in Genesis let people go, but he is still there and still writing for them. He got a master's degree in a biological field, and presumably he's talked about he's working on a PhD. And so I don't know if they're supporting that or what. Oh, the other thing I probably should say, your viewers probably aren't familiar with this, but Answers in Genesis wrote a whole series of articles about young Earth evolutionists, a very critical series of other young Earth creationists who they say are sliding down the slippery slope and are bringing in too much evolutionary thought into their young Earth creationism. And that applies to what we've just talked about, because these would be folks that would say, you know what, maybe on the ark there was an animal that, the most extreme version, just to make it really obvious what the problem is, maybe whales actually were walking animals on the ark, like Pakicetus, and then they evolved to live in the ocean after the flood. And they would have the same kind of arguments. They would say the same kind of things, like maybe God designed them to have various switches come off and on, and they had quickly adapted to living in the sea. And for Ken Ham and others, that's too much evolution. I mean, they're fine with 2 dogs getting off the ark and turning into foxes and wolves and coyotes and like 35 different species that live in different environments and have different genes and different numbers of chromosomes. To me, that's a lot of evolution. But they're saying that other creationists have basically been pushing the envelope. Like, oh, well, maybe all carnivores are related to each other by a common ancestor. So, it's like, how far back are you going to go for common ancestry? And so, to circle around to Harry F. Sanders, he wrote a very, very caustic first article about basically the heretics that are living within the young Earth creationist world. And we need to root them out, right? This is something that's like an evil within, that's growing within our own movement, that we're accepting too much evolution and evolution language. We're taking the language of evolution and we're trying to incorporate it into our own work. And so they wrote a whole series that basically called out Todd Wood, Marcus Ross, and several other young Earth creationists in other organizations, and basically blacklisted him. Maybe that's the other reason they don't have any articles in their research journals, because they've actually have a list of people who are not allowed to send articles to them to get published. So that created a lot of angst among other young Earth creationists. Harry F. Sanders' name was on the first article. And then after I noted it and several other people complained about that article, they took his name off, and then they said it was just a editor, like a general editor in charge. Like, they didn't want to put any blame. There's no authors on any of the 8 articles. But I have followed his writing for years. I know all 8 articles were written by him. So he was Ken Ham's, basically spear, to try to attack other young Earth creationists and set them straight. So yeah, they have their own internal issues.
Scott?
No, I just was thinking of Darwin's bulldog. He's Ken
Yeah,
Ham's bulldog.
I
Huxley
actually
was
was going to use
Darwin's
that phrase
bulldog.
that I held back.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so we are long on time, but before we leave the topic itself, Joel, is there anything we didn't talk about that you think you'd like to make sure gets into this episode?
No, I don't think there's any main topic that we haven't addressed to some extent. I'm currently working on a paper about basically the finances of young Earth creationism. And so I'm a little hyper aware of just how much money they have available to them. And I want to emphasize that Answers in Genesis is the 10-ton gorilla in the creationist world. They absorb the most resource. And that means also like over 30 some $million a year just in contributions, like just individuals contributing.
Wow.
And then their revenues from their theme parks. And that's another big change that's occurred in the world of creationism is it's sort of instead of going out to the people and going and doing conferences and talks and so forth, they've gotten rid of all their conference speakers and so forth. And now it's just a few people and they're focused on the entertainment business, basically bringing people to them and raising capital that way and creating a multimedia enterprise because their emphasis is more on YouTube, social media, and they're putting an enormous amount of money into that and creating really good graphics and very, like they want to be very focused on that. And so it's just the world is shifting that way. But they're bringing in 80 to $100 million in revenues through the Ark Encounter. So even though their attendance is dipping somewhat, they're a profitable business, a nonprofit business, but they're profitable.
Wow.
And
where they spend their money is something to watch.
On that dipping attendance numbers, I got to say this, Joel, because I mentioned this to you a short while back. I'm wondering how much of that is Canadians not crossing the border. There's a lot of Canadians going to the Ark Adventure, or there used to be, and I think they're not. And I think the Ark Adventure is feeling that.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought of that angle. Yeah, it's all the Canadians' fault.
Yeah.
Right.
Now, the last time we had you on, getting back to the whole theme park, the transition towards the theme park mission. The last time we had you on, you mentioned, so there's the Ark Adventure and there's the Creation Museum, but you mentioned that they were building a Tower of Babel.
Oh.
What's come of that?
The Tower of Babel is defunct.
Ah.
Oh.
Yeah, it's no longer on the building plan. Actually, I have right in front of me right now the 2025 report for Answers in Genesis, their own like here's our success from the last year. And at the end of it, they have coming soon. I mean, they have a brand new multi-million-dollar welcome center at the Ark Encounter. They have this Jerusalem model, like they built a huge building, and then they have a huge like layout of all of Jerusalem in like miniature form. They've been working on that for a couple of years, so that's a display you can go see. They're building a couple more restaurants. I think that's more of a priority, is building things that produce revenue.
Right.
Maybe Tower of Babel would have been a revenue maker too, I suppose. It could have had a lot of merchants in there.
Yeah.
They have restaurants?
Yeah, there's a big restaurant at the Ark Encounter, and they're building a much larger eating area at the Creation Museum. They're extending out the Creation Museum for that. So they're spending $20 to $40 million in more infrastructure over this last year and this coming year.
Wow.
And so it's a battle for like, we got to cut, it's like all museums and theme parks. If you don't have something new, it's hard to get somebody to come back.
Right.
So they're in this never ending cycle of like, I got to build more to basically bring in the same number of people. And even that is going down. And the economy isn't going to help either. And apparently Canadians not coming either is really gonna sink it. But yeah, they're building out constantly, which means just more expense. So what the future is, that'll be very interesting. And it's all going to have to, a lot of it's going to come down to that succession plan with Ken Ham, because without Ken Ham as a fundraiser, your $30 to $40 million base of just incoming income just through donations, if that slips significantly, that'll impact all of their other ministries.
Are there any major, other than like you said, the general public, are there major funders? Are there any, wealthy?
That's something. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
He just announced a new campaign to raise another $10 million, and he has some individual or family that will match anybody's donation up to $1 million
Wow.
at a time. So they're probably going to donate a couple million. There is some dark money somewhere coming into Answers in Genesis that has, I mean, like political action
Yeah.
fund type of thing,
Yeah.
like
Oh,
somebody,
wow.
some big donor that wants influence over cultural issues.
Right.
Because Ken Ham and others there have done a lot more political lobbying.
Yeah.
They also got that $30 million Toyota headquarters in Cincinnati, and they never asked for donations to purchase that. Somebody had bought them multi-million dollar facility. And I think a lot of it does have to do with they see them as a growing multimedia newsy sort of, because they're doing a lot of news stuff, a lot of social media. They want to be this, well, they haven't, you can pay for their back end video service, which is lots of Christian vetted videos and nature films and all these different things. And they're generating lots of content for that. So they want to be an alternative media for your kids. Here's a safe, like, pay your $20 a month and have your kids watch this material. And it covers like all of life, right?
Right.
You got reality TVs. Yeah, they want to create all that stuff. And so that's why I say Answers in Genesis is much more than just a creation science thing.
Okay.
That was just a catch. The dinosaurs are just a catch to bring people into the larger fold of this bigger idea of influencing all of US society, really. And so that's why I think there are big backers behind that, because they see it as like, I'm not just funding creation science or this museum or the Ark. I'm funding something much larger, something that's going to have influence over politics in society.
Right.
And that's their leg up over the other organizations, which are just focused on like doing creation science or really talking about the Bible and how we understand science questions. That doesn't become a bigger thing. So that's why they're all stuck in their little silos of smaller amounts of influence.
Okay. A number of years ago, I read a very kind of the definitive biography of Billy Graham. And one thing that fascinated me about it was, because I hadn't really realized this before, there's a huge amount of money in the US of wealth of kind of conservatives that are very concerned about kind of the American way, and capitalism and democracy. It's very secular. It's not necessarily religious. For example, Graham's first big supporter that really put him on the map was Hearst, was William Randolph Hearst. He the famous line was "Pump Graham." He said to the L.A. newspapers he really wanted to end. And Hearst was no Christian, but it's kind of like what we're seeing with Trumpism, I think, where there's this well of just conservative dollars that can get funneled to these organizations, and many of them Christian organizations who gladly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
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 It's a form of sort of this secular Christianity, this mix of like your goals are somewhat in sync with my goals. So let's get together and I'll use you, you use us.
Right. Good moral values, that kind of stuff, pro-family and all that. And we've really seen the ugly side of that, I think, in the last few years.
Yeah. Not to get too political, but yeah, that is the cognitive thing that's been done, is like, I don't like these things, or I don't like this behavior. I don't like this, but our core mission, our core value, somehow we feel like is in sync. So therefore we're going to get together.
Yes.
And we're just going to dismiss a lot of behaviors we don't like, or aspects that we don't like.
Right.
Because the other side is so much worse. And that's what Ken Ham is, in his realm, is brilliant in terms of a communicator in that way. He makes it very clear that even if we don't have all the answers, this other side doesn't have the truth. And so it's safer to go with us, even if I can't explain this or I can't explain that. Although he never even likes to say that. He likes to say we have all the answers and it's easy to provide answers.
Right.
Okay, gentlemen, we need to wrap this up. One question I always like to ask our guests, though, Joel, and you've partially answered this, but maybe there's more to be said. Any projects in the works?
I'm overflowing with projects right now. I got to get back to some YouTube things, but I've been thinking strategically about doing, a series of videos that are interconnected. And that'll have to do with a trip I took last summer to Nevada with my sons. And so we explored a lot of volcanoes and hiked and all these things. And I'm going to explore the West in terms of the geology. And of course, it'll be about young Earth creationism as well. But it'll be like my pictures, my photography, our actual experience looking at the rocks and like relating it to like, hey, this is what young Earth creationists say, but I'm standing right here looking at this. And I'm working on a book that kind of goes along with that. And I'm working on I've been convicted that I need to do more scholarly work in this area. It's one thing to be like a popularizer, to be, on here and to have my blog, but some of those aren't long lasting, like having peer-reviewed publications in literature is something that will have more legs and can be referred to more easily by future scholars. So I'm trying to divvy up a little more time that way. So that's why I mentioned that I'm working on a couple papers in which I look at the finances of creationism. I'm looking at a couple other things as well in the creationist realm. And so trying to put some of my blogging work into a little bit more scholarly perspective and just a little bit deeper.
Okay.
That gets to a different audience.
Right.
And so that's sort of my future, is trying to reach a couple other levels of audience. But it's hard. It's like spreading yourself too thin.
Yeah.
And I don't know what to do each day.
So we've had you on fourth. This is the fourth time.
Yeah.
I think we're going to be having you on a fifth time.
Yeah.
Loving it. It's great. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks for joining us, Joel.
All right. Have a good one.
Yeah.
Yep. Bye now. You've been listening to Recovering Evangelicals with your hosts, Luke Jansen and Scott Dyer. Send your comments and suggestions for new episodes to lukejjansen@gmail.com. Join our private discussion group on Facebook by searching for the Recovering Evangelicals podcast group. Look for the logo that you always see at your favorite podcast catcher and ask to be let in. Subscribe to lukejjansen.wordpress.com if you want to get advanced releases and group posts, or browse through our archive for a full listing of all our previous episodes. And please help the podcast by sharing with a friend and leaving a review at your favorite podcast catcher.